Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Congregation Lador Vador and our community series speaker in conjunction with Cornell University's Institute of Politics and Global Affairs at the Brooks School of Public Policy. I'm Brian Land, your host and president of Congregation Lador Vador, a Reformed synagogue here in Oyster Bay. Before I make the formal introduction of tonight's guest, let me please take care of a few items. Firstly, I'd like to recognize our esteemed rabbi of 19 years, Stephen Moskowitz, who is here joining us tonight, and our cantor, and help make tonight's event possible. I would also like to send a special welcome to former North Hempstead Town Clerk Wayne Wink. Beyond that, it is important that I explain why we are here tonight. And when we are here at the Temple, we created this series. It was our intent to become a beacon of light for our entire community. And not just our religious community, but rather the community of our neighbors, our community of people of all faiths, colors, and genders, from towns near and towns far, thanks to the web. It was our hope that we could bring speakers in who would represent the broad diversity of opinions that now resonate within our country. And whether one agreed or disagreed with the speakers, they would leave saying they learned something. To that end, beyond tonight, we are looking forward to hosting John Wallace, former basketball star of Syracuse University and first-round draft pick for the New York Knicks, who will be speaking about his journey and lessons learned during his playing career, growing up on the streets of Rochester, and how he morphed it all into a post-playing career. He will be joining us in person March 1st at 7 p.m. Please note there's a change in date from February 15th. We will then be joined by Fareed Ferdows and Mariah Smith. For those of you who don't know those two people, simply said, Fareed served in the U.S. Army as a translator from its entrance into Afghanistan to the conclusion of the war, having translated for everyone from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to the commander of the U.S. forces in Afghanistan, General Stanley McChrystal. For his dedicated service to the nation, he was awarded 2 Bronze Stars, the 4th highest medal in the U.S. military. Mariah, too, served in the U.S. Army. She served multiple tours in both Iraq and Afghanistan. She's a true American hero who earned 2 Bronze Stars, 6 meritorious service medals, and is airborne and air assault qualified. Suffice it to say, you will get a picture of both Afghanistan and Iraq you might never hear anywhere else. Now let me get to the business at hand and introduce tonight's guest. He's our neighbor and a friend, the owner of Theodore Roosevelt's bookstore here in Oyster Bay, and most importantly, he served our country as a congressman for 16 years, a really long time to survive in Washington. His career in Congress included 4 years as chairman of the Democratic National Campaign Committee, and he served important roles on a host of other important committees. He was remembered as putting partisan politics aside for the sake of a better and stronger nation. President Clinton said of him, he was one of the most thoughtful members of Congress, to which he replied, that isn't saying very much at all. Currently, he serves as director of the new Nonpartisan Institute of Global Affairs at Cornell University, the only academically based institute of politics in the New York City metropolitan area. Its mission is to raise the discourse and deeper understanding of politics and geopolitics. Through the Institute, he, like us, continues to be a beacon of light of education on our country through its young men and women. It is my great pleasure to introduce Oyster Bay's own Congressman Steve Israel.
Thank you.
Most people I know have lots to say, but have very few people who actually listen to what they say. Our second guest tonight is someone who has lots to say, and lots of people who actually listen to what he says and also read what he has to say. Let me rattle off a few of his quotes to give you a picture of our second guest tonight. Please think about them. The American tradition rests on pillars of self-questioning, self-actualization, and disagreement. The people we need to hear from most are the ones who make themselves heard the least, except, of course, on election day. The hater always suffers more than the object of his hatred. Lastly, people want leaders, not ideologues, not people whose life experiences have been so narrow that they've been able to maintain the purity of their youthful ideals, not people whose principal contact with political life comes in the form of speeches and sound bites, rather than decisions and responsibilities. I know for those of you here tonight, and for those of you at home tonight, we will be privileged to get more than sound bites. Tonight we get the voice and views of the former Wall Street Journal columnist and current New York Times columnist, and the 2013 Pulitzer Prize winner for distinguished commentary. It is my great pleasure to present to you tonight Bret Stephens in conversation with Steve Israel, right, left, center, the state of American politics. Please refrain from questions. There'll be an opportunity for those at the end of the program. Sit back, relax, and listen. Thank you all for joining us.
Well, Brian, thank you so much for your leadership as the president of Le Door Vador. I was just telling Brian in the rabbi's office that this is shameless name dropping. I was in a meeting with President Obama with Jewish members of Congress talking about his policies towards Israel. And that meeting got really heated and voices were raised to the point where I felt this is becoming inappropriate. This is still the President of the United States. I may disagree with him, but he is the President of the United States. And at 6 o'clock, and I'm sure you know this, Bret, 6 o'clock, he said, at 6 o'clock, I'm going to dinner with my kids. This meeting is over. And he was walking out of the room, and I felt that I had to break the ice. And so I said, Mr. President, let me ask you a question. You think being President of the United States is the toughest job in the country? He said, being president is the toughest job in the world, Israel. I said, no. Being president of the synagogue is the toughest job in the world. Being president of the United States, it's tough, but not that tough. And let's have another big hand for Bret Stephens for joining with us. Rabbi Moskowitz, thank you so much. To the Cornell community that will be viewing this, we're recording this, and so to the Cornell community around the world, welcome to this conversation with Bret Stephens. Let me, just before we begin the conversation, let me invite you to our next dialogue. It will be on March 3rd with Bernard-Henri Lévy, who wrote the extraordinary book, The Will to See. That will be virtual. We have Governor Hochul next week. If you want more information, that will be a live and in-person event. So for information, just Google Cornell University Institute of Politics. And we hope that we'll see you at these events. So let's get launched right into it because we have such an extraordinary and illustrious guest. Brian is exactly right. People listen to him. I am a voracious reader of Bret. And I want to begin with your perspectives on the state of democracy. We are 1 year from January 6th. I am looking at a poll from NPR Ipsos, and I want to share some data points. 1 year from January 6th, 64% of Americans believe that democracy is failing. Two-thirds of Republicans believe that President Biden stole the election. One half of Democrats believe that what happened on January 6th was an insurrection. Roughly one half of Republicans say it was a riot that got out of control. And here's the data point that really troubles me. 1 in 5 respondents in this poll said that violence is justified to protect democracy or our culture. Now, here's what's really interesting about this. 32% of that 1 in 5 said that they were supporters of President Trump. 22% said they were supporters of President Biden. So the spread isn't that wide among people who believe that democracy is a legitimate form of protest. There are plenty of analyses, but very few prescriptions. And so, Bret, 1 year after January 6th, what is the state of democracy in America, and how do you see it playing out?
That's such a small question. Let me begin by apologizing for being late. I left my office at 4 o'clock, and I was 2.5 hours on the LIE, which is its own commentary about the state of democracy. Actually, it's not such a lighthearted comment in the following sense, which is that a democratic government has to deliver certain kinds of public goods. And if it fails to do it on a consistent basis, then people are going to look for alternatives. There is a reason that today we look at the kind of what appears, at least from a distance, to be the efficient autocracy or dictatorship of China in the way that 90 years ago people looked at what they thought was the efficient dictatorship of fascist Italy, and they say things like, well, at least the trains run on time. Now, we should worry about a state in which you have constant paralysis on the roads, decrepit infrastructure, a public school infrastructure, which is also at multiple levels decrepit, and that was the subject of my column today. A series of cascading failures across the spectrum of what government is supposed to deliver, because that is the first sign that people are going to simply start looking for alternatives. It's going to make previously inconceivable systems of government seem attractive because we are under the impression that those systems deliver. Now, whether they do deliver is a whole other subject, but Americans are within their rights to say that currently democracy is not working the way that we expect it to work. And that's a real problem. That's a problem that every single member of Congress needs to think seriously about. When we talk about democracy, it's us, it's not them. A lot of the conversation about democracy is if only liberals could get their head out of their backsides, or if only conservatives weren't, in favor of a fascistic demagogue, things would be fine. Part of the responsibility of democracy is introspection. Two more things I think that are worth pondering. I mean, and this is very shorthand because you've really asked a big question. We talk about the problems of democracy. We don't talk enough about the problems of liberalism. And when I use the word liberalism, I don't mean that in the sense of Steve's a liberal, I'm a conservative. I mean liberalism in the sense of a set of ideas that have liberty at the center of your political and constitutional principles. The old-fashioned liberalism that would unite someone like Liz Cheney with someone like you, right? That there are some ground rules, common sets of belief. And what worries me as much, perhaps even more than the state of democracy, is the state of liberalism in the United States. By that, what I mean, for example, is that on a bipartisan basis, there is an assault on bedrock concepts of freedom of speech. There is cancel culture on the left. You know what? There's also some fair bit of cancel culture on the right. There is a fear that the free exchange of ideas does more to threaten us than it does to enrich us. There's a fear of the idea of the open society. I am the son of a refugee who came to this country as a displaced person, having survived the Holocaust, with $7 to her name. That's when my mother arrived in 1950. Now Tucker Carlson calls me an elitist. I'm like, what a great country. In one generation, this happened. But the increasing distrust, especially on the right in this country, of the idea of the open society, of the idea that we are enriched by immigration, is another sign, I think, of the deterioration of liberalism. When Donald Trump was elected, those of you who follow my column know I'm a conservative who consistently opposed the Trump presidency. And I kept hearing things, I mean, another name drop. The last time I was in the Oval Office with Barack Obama,
it's funny, I didn't see you there.
It was a smaller meeting, for the principals. He had asked some Never Trump commentators to join him for a conversation, and he said, well, what's your fear? This was after the election of 2016. He said, what's your biggest fear? And one of my, someone whose name I won't mention, said, my biggest fear is global thermonuclear war. That's what a Trump administration would bring. I never was afraid of that. What I really feared from a Trump presidency was the corrosion of the values of a liberal, democratic system. And corrosion is something you don't notice until there's a catastrophic failure. The way I look at the insurrection of January 6th, and it was an insurrection, maybe a farcical insurrection, a failed insurrection, but an insurrection, is that was in effect the culmination of 4 years of the corrosion of the Republican mind, so that it became so infected by conspiracy theories, by irrationalism, that it could lend itself to the preposterous belief that the election had been stolen against mountains of dispositive evidence that it hadn't, and the belief that this not extra-constitutional, unconstitutional, treasonous measure was an appropriate response. That was always at the center of my fear of a Trump presidency. Now, final point, my big fear now is that if the Biden administration cannot make government work, if it cannot solve basic questions of governance that affect all Americans, a secure border, by the way, is one of them, better responses to a pandemic, a president who makes predictions that then turn out to be true, not false, price stability, all kinds of things. If there's this kind of failure of governance, we are not only going to get a second Trump administration, but we are going to get that steady, accelerated corrosion of liberal values that undergird a robust democracy. And that's why I've been despondent about the state of affairs today.
And the midterm elections in November will be the first indication of the state of the American people. If the Republicans win, and the former chairman of the DCCC, I think they will, and I think they'll build a very significant majority. I would sense that that sets up the final 2 years of the Biden administration for absolute failure. Nothing will be done.
Well, the Biden administration has misread its mandate. Mm-hmm. It has misread its mandate. And the reason it did it is because when Biden took office, he thought we are going to come out of a pandemic, we're going to have robust economic growth in a non-inflationary environment. Well, we haven't come out of the pandemic. We have had robust economic growth, but that growth is being undercut by inflation. And so he thought that he could have a transformative LBJ-style presidency. He thought that the conditions were ripe to go for Build Back Better at the $3.9 trillion level and an infrastructure bill nearly as large. I think Americans voted for Biden because he seemed like Joe Normal after 4 years of crazy town. And I've had conversations with people in the White House and said, you guys have to remember that I voted for Biden as a conservative, lifelong Republican voter. I voted for him. You were elected to provide a quality of normality. We wanted something like Clinton without the sleaze, and instead you're going for LBJ at a 50-50 Senate. That's a crazy strategy. So my only hope for the midterm is that it will provide, in the parlance of alcoholism, a moment of clarity for the Democratic Party to understand that if they're not prepared to govern from the center, if they're going to continue to try to govern from the left, they're going to lose, and they're going to invite the very whirlwind they're trying to keep outside the door.
Bret, you talked about the retreat of liberalism, small L liberalism in the country. Let's talk about internationally. What are your views about the status of Western liberalism around the world right now? And how is Putin testing that? And how is China testing it in other governments?
So I had been opposed to the full withdrawal from Afghanistan, first because I thought that we were paying a relatively small price with about 3,000, 4,000 troops in the country in order to prevent a horror from befalling a country to which we had obligations. And just today there was a headline, there have been, since the Taliban took over in August, 1 million refugees from Afghanistan. We are looking at a humanitarian catastrophe that should, especially as a Jewish community, should awaken our moral senses. But beyond Afghanistan, what I feared was that the perception of American weakness, the helicopters from the embassy in Kabul, just as we'd had helicopters 40-odd years ago from the embassy and 47 years ago from the embassy in Saigon, was going to be a signal to aggressive, revanchist, dictatorial regimes that the United States was not seriously prepared to preserve and uphold an international order backed by American will and the willingness to also use force. So it's, as they used to say in my classes on Marxism, it's not an accident, comrades, that what immediately followed from the withdrawal from Ukraine was a dramatic uptick in aggressive military behavior from mainland China against Taiwan, and then this threat of an open invasion of Ukraine. So this is a moment of, I think, consummate, profound peril for the West. Just the other day, my wife and I watched a so-so movie on Munich called Edge of War, which was on Netflix, and we were bored. Not a great movie, but a reminder that the world has sort of been here before, where dictators who the West see as rational actors with limited aims take advantage of periods of weakness and naivete in the West to redraw the map. Now, I think the Biden administration is actually starting to respond in a more effective way. The deployment of troops to frontline NATO states is a good thing. I will praise the Biden administration for doing it. But beyond that, there's also this deeper malaise. You know, it's not just the United States that is a faltering democracy. The democracies in Europe have been faltering for a long time. There are profound structural issues in places like Japan, which have had negative demographics for a long time. And so, you know, you talked earlier in your initial comment, Steve, about, you know, the doubts about democracy. This is a worldwide phenomenon. It's not just an American phenomenon. And unless we start to sort of think about how we renew democratic values and democratic efficacy through a combination of pedagogical efforts, explaining why democracy is ultimately not just a morally better system, but a more effective system, and then reforming our institutions so that I don't have to spend 2.5 hours getting from Long Island City to Oyster Bay, making things work, making stuff work, then I think that this drift is going to continue. The biggest mistake, last point, the biggest mistake that happened at the end of the Cold War is we got it in our heads that the history was evolving in an almost inevitable way towards a liberal democratic conclusion. And we didn't think that actually democratic institutions can falter, can decay, and can collapse if we aren't thoughtful stewards. We just today learned that the United States debt is $30 trillion. That should be an alarm bell about how poorly we have stewarded our democracy in the last few years.
I've heard you twice refer to reforming institutions and eliminating gridlock on the Long Island Expressway as something that really is an essential ingredient to people's trust in government and faith in democracy. There's a wonderful book that I would commend to everybody's attention by Felix Rohatyn. I don't know if you ever read this book called Bold Endeavors, where Rohatyn traces every major decline in the U.S. economy from the Revolutionary War and argues that in each and every episode, what lifted us out was just building things, was showing that the psychological impact of infrastructure, showing people that government can work. We can build a transatlantic highway, we can build tunnels, we can build bridges. There is an important psychological effect and a reminder that government does have a function and can perform and manage. Let's switch to the topic of anti-Semitism. We are here at Le Door Vador. There was an anti-Semitic hate crime, an attack on a synagogue outside of Dallas. And what happened shortly after that was, in my view, a really puzzling and disturbing debate over whether that really was a hate crime. Was it aimed at the Jewish community? You did a piece on this. Here's what you had to say. How can it be, we ask ourselves, that Jews should be victimized twice? First, by being physically targeted for being Jewish. Second, by being begrudged the universal recognition that we were morally targeted too. Take us through your thinking.
So, in the wake of that attack, first the FBI agent in charge made a statement flabbergasting to me, saying that the attacker was not specifically targeting the Jewish community, presumably because his motive was to try to negotiate the release of a terrorist who was being held in a prison not far away in Fort Worth. Now, this was an agent who maybe was speaking kind of above his pay grade, in that it didn't occur to him that this attacker didn't just take a convenience store hostage in order to achieve the same result. He took the synagogue hostage. He called Rabbi Buchdahl in Brooklyn. He ranted and raved about the power of the Jews because he participated and believed in the anti-Semitic fantasy about Jewish power, the idea that if you took some Jews hostage in Texas, you could immediately move the levers of the American government to release a terrorist from serving an 86-year sentence from prison. Now, it's one thing if an FBI agent says something stupid. Then this was immediately retweeted by the Associated Press, by the BBC. And then what was even more disturbing to me is that with one exception, I did not see a single story outside of the Jewish press that said this is an anti-Semitic attack. Now compare that to the attack in Atlanta by that man against several massage parlors, where instantly the presumption, which by the way hadn't been proven and has not been proven, but the presumption was this was an anti-Asian racist attack. Think about the horrendous, horrific slaughter in the Emmanuel African Church in Charleston, South Carolina, where immediately people recognized the racist, white supremacist nature of the attack. And what bothered me, and the reason I wrote a long piece in Sunday Review about this, is that this seems to be part of a pattern in which when Jews are victimized, they are begrudged the immediate recognition of the prejudicial nature of the attack in a way that does not happen with other minorities when they are attacked. So it is a kind of an additional form of anti-Semitism, which is to say that, if an Asian person is attacked on the streets, there's the thought, this must be an anti-Asian attack. But Jews attacked on the street, well, maybe it's a mental health issue, maybe it's something else. The reality is that Jews are, by orders of magnitude, the greatest victims of religiously motivated hate crimes in the United States. How much awareness of this fact is there, would you say, at the nearest university campus? Don't even get me started. Yeah, well, this is precisely the point. So anti-Semitism has now become the hatred whose name people dare not speak, except in one case, which is when it's the obvious type of anti-Semite, the the marchers at Charlottesville, or the murderer at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. And that forms part of a sort of a larger cultural pattern, and that's what I find really profoundly disturbing, which is that the failure of too many people who ought to know better to understand the nature of anti-Semitism and the fact that it is a shape-shifting phenomenon that doesn't have to come from people who identify as neo-Nazis in order to be anti-Semitic. So we are dealing with a threat, and we're only recognizing a small portion of that threat. And I think it's incumbent not just on the Jewish community, but on every, to use a trendy word, every ally of the Jewish community to say, hang on a second, anti-Semitism exists in more forms than the ones that, much of the media likes to talk about, the right-wing fanatic beating up Jews. It's not just a MAGA hat. It's not a MAGA hat phenomenon. It's a right-wing phenomenon. It is a left-wing phenomenon. It is a phenomenon in which also implicates a great deal of anti-Zionism. And it implicates in a serious way, parts of the left which refuse to recognize the anti-Semitism in its own midst. And so, I've always felt, especially, I've always felt that as someone who speaks from the right, I have an obligation to call out the prejudice and bigotries that come from my side. I think that self-policing is part of the health, to get back to our original theme, part of the health of democracy. What I'm begging for from my friends on the left is to exercise the same kind of self-policing. When a member of Congress says that support for Israel is all about the Benjamins, I expect censure, not a failed vote at censure.
Let's go to Capitol Hill. Let's talk about Congress and the White House. I love your dialogues with Gail Collins in the Sunday Times. They're a real treat. Last Sunday, you argued with her about President Biden's announcement that his nominee for Supreme Court will be an African-American woman. You said that that was a bad idea. Why?
Well, I would have no objection to an African-American woman being a Supreme Court nominee. What I objected to was announcing that the only people he's going to interview for the position belong to a race and gender category. I think it goes against sort of fundamental bedrock American ideas that we don't do things in that way. We don't select by race and gender. We select by excellence. We select by merit. We select by affinity to our ideological, moral, juridical persuasions, right? And if it happens that the person is of this color or that should not be the primary consideration. I think two things strike me about it as there's this great line attributed to the French foreign minister Talleyrand, it's worse than a crime, it's a mistake, which is, I have a moral objection to what seems like the explicit tokenization aspect here. And by the way, I had the same objection in 1991 when Clarence Thomas was put on the court with clearly the same in clearly the same frame of mind. I'm not interested in the ideology, I'm interested in that. But I also think it's a mistake in that it's a political mistake. Right now, the Democratic Party has a political problem in that it is seen as having bought too much into what the liberal political scientist Roy Teixeira talks about, the race essentialism of the Democratic Party. We're trying to move, as a country, we ought to be moving beyond race in the direction of Martin Luther King's vision of a colorblind society. The Democratic Party, to many Americans, feels like it's moving in precisely the opposite direction. So even though, it'll be interesting to see how the Republican Party lines up against whoever the nominee happens to be, right? But it's also a problem for the Democratic Party in that they're buying into the very politics that a lot of Americans are mistrustful of, as they were in the election in Virginia when a blue state suddenly turned very, very red because there was a perception that the Democratic Party had moved too far in one direction. Last comment on that, if I were a senator and any qualified nominee were brought in front of the Senate, I would vote to confirm. I profoundly believe that unless someone is manifestly unqualified, they deserve a 99-0 vote, which is what Justice Scalia got. It's what Justice Ginsburg got. That ought to be the general practice. And it goes to the point of the decline in democracy that now every political question is a fight to the death. There's something the matter with that.
Let's stay on this topic of wokeness and identity politics for a moment, if we can. And folks, we're going to go for another 10 minutes or so in conversation, then open it up to you in the remaining 20 minutes. And we do have a hard stop of 7:30. I listened to a podcast that you did with Yehuda Kurtzman from the Shalom Hartman Institute.
People listen to that podcast.
Well, I said I listened to it.
Lots of people seem to listen to
so
it.
far. Well, I think you have a pretty good audience on that. And you talked about this, and I'll be honest with you, I really struggle with this issue. I think that reasonable people who are right of center and left of center really wrestle with finding the balance between bringing down the historic structural barriers to advancement that so many Americans confront without degrading the notion of meritocracy, which is, I think, an essential ingredient in a liberal democracy, meritocracy. And I was struck by a point that you made in that podcast. You said, do we want our systems to be fair? Do we want them to be more meritocratic? And do we want the concept of meritocracy to be enlarged somewhat to make, somewhat to make more room for possibility rather than immediate prior achievement and SAT scores? Absolutely. What bothers you about where the left of center and the right of center are coming from on this issue?
I don't remember saying that, but I guess I did. There's a problem with being a commentator. You're just talking, and people say, "Oh, you said this." Oh my, really? I think that comment was a general view. My wife is German, and Germany is a system in which life's chances are delimited pretty early on. From an early age, you either get into the gymnasium or not. If you're not in the gymnasium, you're looking at a career as an artisan, but not as a lawyer. And I think there's something helpful about the American way of saying, well, you know, maybe you just woke up on the wrong side of the bed the day you were supposed to take your SAT, and it shouldn't be such a defining fact in your life. And I subscribe to that up to a point. On the other hand, I think that ultimately societies in which the meritocratic principle doesn't assert itself at some point in the game are societies that are relegating themselves to mediocrity and to failure. And the result is, you know, in some ways I have a sense of ambivalence. Yes, I think it's a good thing that America became a more self-conscious society in starting to ask, why is it only, you know, white men on the Supreme Court, for example, or overwhelmingly, you know, I mean, certain kinds of representation, so that beyond the legal questions of who had, you know, theoretical access to institutions, there were the real practical questions of, you know, who was really getting in. When I went to high school, I had a very close African-American friend. I knew his SAT scores. He got in everywhere. And I thought, you know what? He's a smart guy. It's fine. It's okay that this should be happening. We've moved beyond that kind of sense of like, let's like give people, you know, a bit of a boost, bit of chance to something like an increasingly structured structured and enforced form of race consciousness in terms of the compositions of different organizations. Now the Oscars has announced that that there are going to be racial quotas in terms of the way movies are made. This seems to me a road to the dissolution of the American ideal, that at the end of the day, it is who you are as a person, not as a skin color, not as an ethnicity, that needs to matter most. And so I don't want to discount that liberal belief, like, you know, give this guy a bit of a chance, give him, you know, open that door a little bit. But at the same time, I don't want that to turn into a kind of a race essentialist vision of American life, which is antithetical to the founding principles of this or any other liberal society. And this is what worries me about wokeness. Like many ideologies that begin with a principle that seems fair and reasonable and end up in a practice that seems intolerant and to use a 10-cent word, Procrustean. I should use that word.
It's a great word.
It's a real word.
That's a great word.
Look it up. I think the problem that you have with woke ideology is that it's the Maoist version of social democracy. You know, it has become so extreme, insistent, intolerant, humorless, nasty, and it increasingly typifies one institution after another. it ruins people's lives. It ruins the lives of people who didn't realize that some social norm had changed just 3 years ago, and they had to get wise to the new, to the new newspeak. And that's what bothers me. The other aspect, Steve, is that there is in the new dispensation, of the new kind of woke dispensation, there are red flags for Jews. And I want to just point to 3 of them. One of them is the supplanting of ethnicity with race as a primary marker in American life. It used to be, I'm a Jew and you're Mexican and you're Polish. America was a land of a lot of little ethnicities paired against a big WASP establishment. And all of these ethnicities suffered various forms of discrimination. We Jews had redlining issues, law firms that wouldn't admit us, other kinds of discrimination. Unquestionably, the worst kind of discrimination was suffered by African Americans and by Native Americans. I don't want to compare them, but America was a land of lots of ethnicities, right? And suddenly, as many of those barriers faded to Jews and other ethnic groups, the defining characteristic became one of race. So we entered into this world of racial binaries where people were either white or of color. Right? You hear this phrase, of color, quite a bit. Suddenly, Jews found themselves shunted, at least Jews who aren't Jews of color, into a category that we don't recognize. This gets to the Whoopi Goldberg issue. Since when did Jews become white, right? Certainly the people who were trying to persecute my mother in Nazi-occupied Europe didn't consider my mother a white woman. So the racialization of identity is something that ought to worry Jews, right? We have a history with this that's still in living memory, and it didn't work out well. The second aspect is this replacement of the American idea of success with the concept of privilege. Why did Jews do so remarkably well in the United States in a way we didn't do as well in Europe? I think there's a reason it's not a legal reason. It's not about religious liberty, although that helps. It's that in much of Europe, when a minority succeeds, it elicits envy. And envy ultimately leads to persecution. Successful Jews in France with Dreyfus, and then of course in Germany, rose until they were cut down. In America, in part because of our Calvinist origins, which saw worldly success as a sign of divine favor, Jewish success didn't lead to envy, it led to admiration. So the great story in America is as Jews succeeded, we weren't like, oh, those damn Jews, how they done so well. Look at that minority that did so remarkably well. I mean, we are now a minority that occupies the seat of the Secretary of State, the Chief of Staff, the Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of Homeland Security. It's amazing, right, that we live in a country which allowed us to go as far as our talents would take us without the envious majority cutting us down. But if success is redefined as privilege, then privilege is a concept of something you didn't earn, something you didn't get, something to which you are not entitled. So the new woke idea of, oh, well, you have your privilege, you should check your privilege, these are phrases you will hear commonly on college campuses, is one that ought to concern Jews, because we are a very, quote, privileged minority, even though we think of ourselves as a successful minority. We think we've achieved what we have by our parents' efforts or our own efforts. We're living in a world where those efforts don't count, where it's seen as a form of social inequality. And the final point I would make, and this, I know I'm going on for a long time.
No, it's good.
But the final point I would make is, it used to be the case that America subscribed to an idea of free speech which was very congenial to Jewish culture. Jewish culture is irreverent, it's skeptical, it's naysaying. We like activists, we like dissidents, we like pains in the asses, we ironize. From the days of Abraham, having arguments with God, okay, we are a disputatious kind of people. And for generations, that was a culture that flourished in America, right? And it's why so many cultural icons are Jewish. Lorne Michaels, the guy who made up SNL, you know, I mean, he's Canadian, but no one's perfect. But you know, Jewish, that was the animating spirit. We now live in a spirit that looks with extreme skepticism and disdain at expressions of intellectual independence. And this too worries me as a profound threat of woke culture to that Jewish spirit of being in opposition, of not joining the prevailing ethos. So those things are playing on my mind.
Bret Stephens, ladies and gentlemen, give him another big hand. Now, here's what I'd like to do. It is 7:10. I'm going to take us to 7:22 or so. I have a final question, but I
promise there'll be a short answer.
No. I want to end on a certain note with you. So let's open it up. And I see we have students from Syosset High School. I want to encourage them to ask questions, but let's open it up to you. Raise your hand, and I will recognize you. Howard Wall, I see.
Yes, thank you.
Oh, actually, the microphone is, the rabbi is handing you the microphone.
Well, thank you. Question really relates to your latest job with, I think it's the New York Times. Now, the New York Times has certainly been a bête noire for Israel and much of the Jewish community. Your thoughts about that?
Well, you know, for as long as I can remember, the New York Times has had on its opinion pages a very stalwart champion of the state of Israel and the Jewish people. And whether it was Abe Rosenthal or Bill Safire, that was a vital voice. And I don't think of myself as Abe or as Bill. They're great, you know, really great figures. But I'd like to think that I'm walking in their footsteps. The New York Times is by far, you know, when I was at the Wall Street Journal, I thought the Wall Street Journal and the Times were equivalent papers. And I went to the Times and I realized it's not even close. Just yesterday it was announced we have 10 million subscribers. Our influence is immense. And I've always been a contrarian all my life. I always feel weird being in company where my views dominate. I always like being the naysayer. And so you know, I think it's important to have my point of view represented in the paper and to give it that kind of range and expression. And I would add, I know there is no one on earth who doesn't have complaints about the New York Times. It is an incredible, incredible journalistic institution. And this is another discovery of mine. The resources it can bring to bear and is increasingly bringing to bear on all kinds of stories are just unmatched. So even critics of the Times, and I'm sometimes a critic of the Times and have been a critic of the Times in the pages of the Times, but even critics of the Times should recognize just how much they depend for their information diet on what a Times reporter in Islamabad or Tokyo or Kiev or you know, I don't know, Syosset is bringing to their news diet. So I've heard the criticism of the Times for a long time, but I'm happy I'm there.
Please. Hold one moment because we're going to get a microphone for you. This is a full-service rabbi.
Yes, it is. It's on. Okay. Brett, you made the remark before about how justices for the Supreme Court, you mentioned two that were appointed by 99 to nothing, and that's what should be based on merit. In today's world, can you imagine such a thing happening where if a Democrat suggests someone, it is the Republican's duty to absolutely cast scorn and just do everything possible to see that it doesn't happen?
Yeah, so I basically, I mean, you know, we're getting back to our earlier theme. You know, The sign of a healthy democracy is one in which the fringe bends towards the center. And the sign of an unhealthy democracy is one in which the center bends towards the fringe. And the kind of 50-50 votes that we've been having on Supreme Court justices in the last few years is another evidence of the sign of the unhealth of our democracy. The idea that people can't get it through their heads that there is a larger good in accepting that when the guy or the president from the other team wins, he's owed deference in terms of his judicial picks. Now, there's always a limit. People with long memories, might remember the famous senator from Nebraska, Roman Hruska, who, when Richard Nixon nominated a guy called Carswell, who was considered a total mediocrity to the Supreme Court, Hruska stood up and said, "Shouldn't the mediocrities of America be given a little representation on the court?" He actually said that. He was head of the Ag Committee. So obviously, you have to look for, you have to look for nominees who are fully qualified and capable. But again, when President Obama nominated Justice Kagan and Sonia Sotomayor, their judicial philosophies are far from my own, but I absolutely supported their confirmation.
I just want to give you a very quick data point that I think it helps explain the polarization and dysfunction of Congress. And then we're going to go to Arnie Herz. When I was elected, and I hope that our students from Syosset High School remember this, 2000, I'm elected to Congress. There were 150 competitive districts, purple districts, where compromise and bipartisanship was actually something you campaigned on because the electorate was somewhere in the middle. When I chaired the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee 11 years later, 2011, the number of moderate districts where compromise was of value had shrunk to 75. Today, there are about 16 truly moderate districts where compromise is valued. And I define them by the 9 current districts that elected a Democratic member of Congress and voted for Trump, and the 7 congressional districts that elected a Republican member of Congress and voted for Biden. All of the other districts have been gerrymandered to the far left or the far right to protect partisan interest. Most of my colleagues and former colleagues do not wake up in the morning worried about losing a general election. They wake up every morning dreadfully afraid of losing in a primary. And that forces incumbents to a default position of obstructing whatever the other party desires. Let's go to, sorry for that, but I think it's a really interesting data point.
Thanks, Steve. Brett,
Arnie is
thank
the
you very
president
much.
of the American Jewish Committee on Long Island.
Thank you. To me, the greatest threat to the Jewish people today is a nuclear Iran. I know we haven't had a chance to talk about it. It threatens 50% of the Jewish people. And it's quite a mess, and curious to get your take on whether or not they'll be able to get a deal, and if not, what the plan B is, and is that pragmatic going to be able to stop this?
Another tiny little question. Well, look, the negotiations have been secretive. I was alarmed by a report about a week ago that members of President Biden's own team are stepping off, are resigning from the negotiating team because they are dismayed by the breadth of concessions that Rob Malley, the lead negotiator, seems prepared to make. A year ago, I wrote a column urging Secretary Blinken not to put Malley on his team. I remember him as Syria's principal apologist back at the beginning of the Syrian uprising. So I'm very worried. I mean, 2 things frighten me: no deal, and the deal we're likely to get. I think the deal we're likely to get frightens me a little bit more, because what we don't want to do is essentially create a green light for Iran to acquire a robust nuclear capability with the permission and sanction of the international community. That's why I objected to the initial deal in 2015. which is that that deal gave Iran a patient pathway to a nuclear weapon. They just had to bide their time. And I've always thought that the right approach to Iran is to say, you will never get within 100 miles of a nuclear bomb, and this is one of the core, this should be a core principle of American foreign policy. Because a regime that is prepared to stone a woman to death, that is prepared to hang gay people from in nooses in the squares of Tehran, shouldn't be trusted with nuclear weaponry. Not just because they might use it, which they might, but simply because of the threat that that represents. And one of the things that I worry about, this is a point that Steve brought up, is just the erosion of will in the Western democracies to at least police the bright red lines of the international, of global order. An Iran with nuclear weapons, by the way, means a Saudi Arabia with nuclear weapons. And a Saudi Arabia with nuclear weapons probably means a Turkey with nuclear weapons. I don't know if any of you follow Mr. Erdogan's mental health, but it alarms me. And a Turkey with nuclear weapons could mean, let's say, an Egypt with nuclear weapons. So if the idea of deterrence was difficult in the days when it was the USSR versus USA with equivalent arsenals, and you guys had guys like Herman Kahn and Albert Wohlstetter and the whole Rand Corporation, gaming out what you needed to maintain balance, second strike capabilities, submarines, all this stuff. How do you game out, any of you who are game theorists, a Middle East, the most combustible region in the world, where you have 4 or 5 nuclear weapon states, each of them at daggers drawn with one another? Is Iran a threat to Israel, or is it a threat to Saudi Arabia? Are Israel and Saudi Arabia friends, but how does that play out vis-a-vis Turkey? You really start, the moment you start to think about this, you realize just why that is so extraordinarily dangerous. So again, I think this is a moment in which, actually, I think Biden has an opportunity to show some real seriousness by walking away from the negotiations and saying, this is the deal we expect, and this is the deal we're going to get, and this is the deal we're prepared to enforce. Final point, don't forget that Iran, as fanatical and as threatening as it is a country with a GDP roughly the equivalent of Greater Philadelphia. So we are not facing an adversary that stands 100 feet tall, and we should remember that.
Let's take one final question over here. I'm sorry? Are you yielding to this? Okay, all right. Final question.
Thank you. Appreciate the conversation this evening. So I think this conversation has elucidated a lot of the troubling points in the world and in America right now. Are there any bright spots, anything in the short term?
That's perfect. Now,
that's helpful.
Hold that. What a great segue, because it leads into what I'd hope to be the final question. So thank you for that. I want to, with apologies that we have to end, because we could go on for another hour easily, but I want to try and end on a positive note. These conversations tend to be rather serious and at times despairing. Going back to Bret's conversation with Gail Collins in last Sunday's Times, here's what he said. And remove any sharp items from your pockets and put them away for a moment. He said, on the whole, I'm pretty despondent about the state of things in general. Somewhere between a presidency that seems adrift, a stock market that feels like it's on the verge of a crash, a country in which half the population is in a permanent state of incandescent fury at the other half, and a world that's holding its breath waiting for Vladimir Putin to bite off a slice of Ukraine the way another revanchist European dictator once took a slice of Czechoslovakia. I'm beginning to get a sense of what the world might have felt like in the 1920s or 1930s. Having said that, what does give you hope?
Three things. Okay, so you mentioned my conversations with Gail, and that was out of our conversation. So if you look to social media to see how we call it the conversation does on social media, it's nowhere. It is one of the single most popular features in the New York Times, with the highest engagement rate, which is to say people actually read the whole thing. And the readership is gonzo. It's unbelievable. Gail and I can't believe it because it's, we just shoot the proverbial you-know-what, and there it is. It's the easiest thing we do, and it's wildly popular. And it's wildly popular because people like the civility, the humor, the fact that here we come from two not opposite sides, but different sides of most questions, and we get along, and we genuinely like each other. And I think the reason is that more people than social media would lead you to believe want civility, want civil disagreement, want to be able to have differing points of view, but with a laugh, not this kind of scowling fury that typifies so many conversations that are happening because we've devised algorithms on Twitter optimized for outrage, right? I mean, probably someone will come out of here and they will tweet, Bret Stephens is whatever, and okay, fine, right? But this is 280 categories, 280 characters that are primed to be nasty, but people aren't like that. So that's one thing that gives me hope. The very popularity of our conversation is one of those things. The second thing is you guys from high school. The United States, every 50 years, decides to swan dive into some kind of toilet. I don't know why, it just happens every 50 years. We just, like the Acapulco divers, they just go whoop and all the way into the toilet, and miraculously we emerge. We've had a history of going through bleak periods, and we emerge because it turns out the kids are all right. It turns out they don't necessarily want to carry on the feuds and the fights. They are more interested in reinvention and renewal. And America, more than any other country that I can think of, has this capacity for regeneration, for renewal. That's absolutely astonishing. You see it in all kinds of ways. Cities that were considered lost, right? Take Pittsburgh, right? Which Dickens called hell with the lid off, right? It's a beautiful, downsized but beautiful city in western Pennsylvania. Crime, which had been skyrocketing for generations, suddenly plummeted. Now it's going back up, it'll plummet again. We have this capacity. And finally, and this is weird because this is a sanctuary, I'm Jewish, but my favorite poet was a Catholic poet, and Gerard Manley Hopkins. There's a beautiful poem which he says, "The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. It gathers to a greatness like the ooze of oil crushed. Why do men then now not wreck his rod? Generations have trod, and all is seared with trade, smeared, bleared with toil, and wears man's smudge and shares man's smell. The soil is bare now, nor can foot feel being shod. And yet, for all this, nature is never spent. It wears the dearest freshness deep down things, and though the last light off the black west went, O morning at the brown brink eastward springs. For the Holy Ghost over bent world broods with warm breast and with bright wings." I love that poem. It ought to be a reminder that there are new beginnings, there are new dawns, our problems do get solved, we do find the capacity, the resource, and the inner decency to get over what ails us. And we always have, and you guys will.
With Bret Stephens, you get amazing prose and pretty good poetry at the same time. Thank you, Bret. Fabulous. For more information about the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs at Cornell University, Google Cornell Institute of Politics. Join us for Governor Hochul next week and Bernard-Henri Lévy on March 2nd, and many others. Thanks very much. Thank you, sir.